They thought he was just another tired traveler waiting for a red-eye flight. But what happened next revealed so much more than anyone expected. Have you ever witnessed someone being underestimated only to turn out to be someone truly powerful? Share your story in the comments. Let's talk about how appearances can be deceiving. It was just before dawn at Seattle-Tacoma International Airport, the kind of quiet that only airports seem to know, hushed announcements. Scattered yawns, the smell of strong coffee, and that soft buzz of anticipation. I was there for my 6 a.m. flight to Dallas, sitting across from Gate B12 when I first noticed him. A tall, lean black man, maybe in his early 50s, with salt and pepper hair, in a worn brown leather jacket that looked like it had stories of its own. He wasn't flashy, didn't check his phone every 5 seconds like the rest of us. And he didn't carry much, just a small duffel bag and a paperback novel. He had this stillness about him, like someone who's seen enough of life to not be in a rush. To me, he looked like a teacher, or maybe a retired vet. Certainly not someone important, at least. That's what I thought back then. He sat near the window looking out at the tarmac like he was thinking about something far away. Nobody paid him any mind. People walked right past him without a second glance. I even saw a businessman nudge his kid away when the man stood up to stretch like proximity was a threat. There was no entourage, no flash of ID, no suit or tie, just him and that quiet strength. At some point, an airline worker passed by and greeted him, and he responded with the warmest. "Morning, brother," I'd heard all day, and even then no one batted an eye. If I had blinked, I might have missed him. But something about the way he carried himself, like he knew exactly who he was and didn't need anyone else to keep my attention. We were all waiting for the same flight to Atlanta. I didn't know yet that this man would be the reason that morning became unforgettable. I didn't know that I was looking at Mayor Solomon Reeves, the newly elected mayor of Atlanta, returning from a quiet diplomatic meeting on sustainable housing. But I'd find out soon enough. He boarded the flight like any other passenger, nodding politely to the flight crew as he stepped into the cabin of Flight 392 bound for Atlanta. And I remember how he paused just briefly before turning into the business class section and taking his seat by the window in 3A. His leather jacket folded neatly on his lap, and his eyes returning once again to that faraway look, as if his mind were still in another country, in another conversation somewhere between policy and principle. And maybe that's why he didn't notice, or maybe chose not to notice, what was happening just a few gates down, where another man dressed in a tailored navy suit and the kind of watch that glints like a billboard was growing visibly impatient as his assistant frantically typed into her iPad, trying to smooth over some sort of seating issue. And that man, who I later learned was Gregory Dunlap, the CEO of a major energy conglomerate, wasn't used to waiting, wasn't used to being told sorry. Business class is full, and certainly wasn't used to anyone telling him no. And when the gate agent repeated it for the third time, I saw it happen. The subtle shift from irritation to entitlement, the way he narrowed his eyes and leaned in just slightly, like he was about to make this someone else's problem. And sure enough, a few moments later, a senior flight attendant was called over a tall white woman with slick blonde hair in a bun so tight you could bounce a quarter off it. And she walked onto that plane like she owned it, her eyes scanning business class with surgical precision until they landed on the man in seat 3A. And I swear to you, there was a pause, just at a flicker of something behind her expression. And then she leaned down to a colleague and said something under her breath that made the other attendant stiffen. And next thing you know, she was standing in front of the man I now know as Mayor Reeves, flashing a professional smile that didn't reach her eyes and asking to see his boarding pass just to confirm. And he handed it to her calmly without question. And she looked at it for a few seconds longer than she needed to, like she was hoping it would change in her hands, and then she gave it back and walked away, only to return a moment later, this time asking if he'd mind relocating to economy to accommodate a special guest. And I remember feeling a chill then. Because it wasn't just what she said, it was how she said it, the practiced politeness that covered up a decision already made. And he looked up at her with the same calm he carried into the airport and asked, "And why me?" And when she replied with "No reason, sir," I knew she was lying, and so did he. And something in the air shifted, not loud, not dramatic, but heavy, like a storm brewing behind clouds that hadn't yet opened. And I looked around and realized no one else seemed willing to see what was happening, except maybe me, and maybe the woman sitting 2 rows back who stopped mid-email and stared, sensing something was deeply wrong but not yet knowing just how wrong it would get. Mayor Reeves didn't raise his voice, Didn't make a scene, he just sat there, eyes locked with the flight attendant, as if daring her to finish what she'd started. And she blinked first, breaking eye contact as she mumbled something about operational adjustments. But we both knew what it really was, and she wasn't prepared for someone who wouldn't quietly back down, especially not a black man in a hoodie with no entourage or titles plastered across his chest. So she turned away and walked briskly toward the cockpit, whispering something urgent to the captain, and I sat there thinking about how easily people forget that dignity isn't worn on a wrist or draped over your shoulders in silk. It's something much deeper. And when she returned, she didn't confront him again, not directly. Instead, she tried to quietly pressure another passenger, a young black man in maybe his late 20s, who had boarded just ahead of us and looked nervous from the moment he sat down into switching seats and when he asked why me. Her answer was silence and a pointed finger toward economy, and I watched his confusion turn to embarrassment. And just as he started to rise, Reeves where he stood, not quickly, not dramatically, but with the weight of someone who had carried much heavier burdens before. And in that deep, unwavering voice, he simply said, "That's enough," and everyone in business class who had been pretending not to notice suddenly couldn't ignore it anymore. Newspapers were lowered, laptops were closed, and all eyes turned to this confrontation that no one wanted to acknowledge 5 minutes ago. And Reeves continued, "This is not about logistics. You're making these decisions based on what you think someone looks like, not on who they are or what their ticket says. That is called discrimination." And I saw the blood drain from the attendant's face as her composure cracked just slightly, and she tried to gather herself, warning him not to cause a scene. But it was too late. The scene had already been caused, not by noise, but by silence, by the power of someone calmly standing up for what's right. And I could feel it, a shift in the energy of the cabin, a realization rippling through the passengers like heat through metal. And while the CEO was still outside waiting for a solution to magically open up inside, it was crystal clear that something much bigger was unfolding. Something that wasn't just about a seat, or a flight, or even this one day, but about years and years of assumptions and arrogance, finally being met with an immovable presence. And I looked at Reeves, tall, still unbothered, and I realized that whatever happened next, this wasn't a man who would be moved by pressure or prejudice, because he had faced worse, survived more, and carried himself with a quiet authority that no one in that cabin could deny, even if they still didn't know his name. By the time Mr. Dunlap, the CEO, finally boarded the plane, the energy had shifted in ways he couldn't see, too absorbed in his own importance to notice the tension thick in the cabin air. And Claire, the flight attendant, greeted him with a radiant smile, offered him champagne like he was royalty, and assured him the seating issue is being handled, while the man who had refused to be moved, Mayor Reeves, simply buckled his seatbelt and stared calmly out the window, tapping his fingers lightly on the armrest as if conducting a silent orchestra. And I remember thinking how strange it was that no one had even tried to connect the dots yet, how everyone assumed he was just a passenger with too much pride, when in fact he was the most important person on that plane. And yet the CEO strutted down the aisle like the cabin belonged to him, passing right by Reeves without so much as a glance, while Claire followed behind, adjusting his seat and fluffing his blanket, her laughter like glass, brittle and hollow. And as the plane taxied onto the runway, there was a hush that settled over the cabin. Not the usual pre-takeoff silence, but something deeper, something charged, and outside I could just make out the soft orange glow of dawn kissing the tips of the runway lights. And I couldn't help but wonder how things would unfold when we landed, because there was something about Reeves's stillness that didn't feel passive. It felt like strategy, like patience worn into armor and mid-flight. When Claire finally circled back with her tray and offered him a drink, her smile seemed strained now, her voice a touch too high when she asked, "Can I get you anything, sir?" And he looked up with a coolness that could slice steel and said, "Water will be fine," and that was it. No fanfare, no apology exchanged, and she moved away quickly, like she didn't want to linger in the presence of someone she had so clearly underestimated. And in sharp contrast, the CEO was being doted on like a celebrity, Claire hanging on his every word as he boasted about upcoming projects in Georgia and how his company was bringing progress to underdeveloped regions. And when he chuckled and said, "Atlanta's lucky to have us," Claire nodded enthusiastically, completely unaware that the man he was referring to, the man leading that very city, was sitting just 2 rows away, listening in silence. Not out of weakness, but because he understood the power of timing. And it was the woman behind me, a nurse I later learned, who leaned over to her seatmate and whispered, That's Mayor Reeves they're treating like dirt. And though her neighbor's eyes widened, neither of them spoke up, perhaps out of respect for Reeves's own quiet dignity, perhaps out of fear. But either way, the realization began to ripple quietly through the rows, not loudly or with confrontation, but like the slow buildup of thunder far off in the distance. And I sat there, knowing that we were all headed toward a landing that none of us would forget. As the plane began its descent into Hartsfield-Jackson Atlanta International Airport, the early morning light spilling through the windows painted the cabin in soft gold, and people began to stir, stretching, fastening seatbelts, preparing to return to their lives. But there was a new hum in the air, subtle but unmistakable. And it started when a few passengers noticed the line of black SUVs and uniformed officers forming just beyond the runway, their polished boots glinting in the sun. And at first people assumed it was for a dignitary, maybe a senator or celebrity, but no one thought to connect it to the quiet man in 3A until the murmurs started to spread. Questions floated through the rows like smoke. Are those police? Is there a threat? Why the security? And someone near the front joked nervously, "Are we landing in a war zone?" To which another replied, "No, looks like someone of importance arriving." And that was when Mr. Dunlap leaned back smugly in his chair and muttered to Claire, "Must be for me." And she laughed with him as if the mere presence of a convoy could only ever belong to someone like him. And she readied herself to escort him off the plane ahead of the others. Clipboard in hand, posture upright, fully prepared to play the role of handler to a corporate king. But before the doors even opened fully, the tone shifted again, this time like a glass shattering in slow motion. Because when the first step hit the cabin floor, it wasn't Dunlap's. It was the boot of a tall officer in full dress, black beret sharp on his head, his eyes scanning each row until he reached 3A, and the silence that followed was so complete, you could hear the hum of the overhead lights, the squeak of a rubber sole, the rustle of a page being turned by someone unaware of what was unfolding. And then the officer brought his hand up in a crisp salute and said in a voice that carried across the entire plane, "Mr. Mayor, welcome home." And the moment hung there in the air like a held breath, as the truth settled onto every passenger like morning dew, cold and undeniable. And Claire's clipboard dropped slightly, her mouth parting just a bit as she looked from the officer to Reeves and back again, realizing with visible horror who she had tried to displace, who she had humiliated. And Dunlap sat frozen, the color draining from his face as if someone had unplugged him. And Reeves rose slowly, not smug, not triumphant, but with the quiet dignity he had carried since the terminal in Seattle. And he turned to Dunlap and offered a nod. Nothing more, nothing less, and then stepped out of the row as more officers entered, two of them heading straight for Claire and Dunlap. One of them stating flatly, "You are being detained for questioning," and Claire gasped, "Wait me, why?" But the answer came swift and cold. "You publicly disrespected a sitting head of state on national soil. That is a federal offense," and I watched as they were escorted out in stunned silence, their arrogance trailing behind them like smoke from a fire that had finally burned out. While outside, a crowd cheered behind security fences, flags waving, cameras flashing, and in that moment, the man in 3A was no longer a mystery. He was a symbol, a statement, a quiet reckoning. The heat on the tarmac was already rising as Mayor Reeves descended the aircraft stairs, flanked by his security detail. His presence met with cheers from a gathered crowd behind the airport fencing, some holding small flags, others with their phones raised high, to capture the moment that had quietly transformed into history. And while the people welcomed him home with open admiration just behind him, Claire and Mr. Dunlap were being escorted into two separate black SUVs, their expressions stripped of confidence and their voices silent, and the presidential guards said nothing to them, not out of cruelty, but out of principle, because in that moment, no words could justify their actions and no excuses would be entertained. It was the kind of silence that weighs heavier than shouting, the kind that speaks of reclaimed dignity and justice long deferred. And inside the airport terminal, a small press conference had been arranged, modest by design, just a handful of local journalists. But the cameras were already rolling when Reeves stepped up to the microphone, still wearing the same leather jacket he'd had on during the flight. And he didn't deliver a fiery speech or dramatic monologue. He simply said, "In Atlanta, we don't measure a person's worth by the color of their skin or the price tag on their suit. We measure it by the content of their character and their commitment to community." And with those few words, he sent a message not just to the room, but to the nation. And news of the incident traveled fast. Video clips and photos leaked online. Almost instantly, the footage of the salute, the stunned faces, the handcuffs, all of it became viral. Within hours, headlines blazed across social media platforms. Flight fiasco Mayor Reeves faces, discrimination at 30,000 feet. Arrogance meets accountability on the tarmac. Respect must be earned, not assumed, and hashtags like #StandWithReeves and #dignity. And the sky trended worldwide, sparking conversations across dinner tables, classrooms, and newsrooms. And within 24 hours, both Claire and Dunlap Law were formally charged with public misconduct and racial discrimination toward a government official. The charge is serious and undeniable. And while the French-owned airline attempted damage control with a carefully worded press release that read more like legal padding than genuine remorse, it didn't stop the wave of backlash. Calls for boycotts erupted across communities and prominent figures in politics. Entertainment and civil rights voiced support for the mayor, while across the city of Atlanta, murals began appearing overnight. Reeves in profile hoodie, and all the word dignity painted beneath in bold letters. And meanwhile, in a holding facility just outside the city, Claire broke down during questioning, her voice cracking as she cried, "I didn't know who he was. I was just following procedure." But the lead investigator, a seasoned black woman with years of quiet battles behind her eyes, simply responded, "You didn't need to know who he was. You only needed to treat him like a human being." And as for Dunlap, he tried every connection, every call, every back channel he could muster to make the problem disappear. But none of them worked, and when his lawyer requested diplomatic leniency, the judge gave a clear ruling. No immunity, no exceptions. Let justice be equal. Mayor Reeves never once gloated, never gave in to the temptation of rubbing salt into wounds or basking in revenge. Instead, after the press whirlwind began to slow, and the last of the flashing cameras turned elsewhere, he simply returned to his work, reviewing infrastructure plans, approving new public school investments, meeting with community leaders in underserved neighborhoods. And while the world talked about what had happened on that flight, Reeves moved on with quiet focus, refusing interviews that asked for dramatics, turning down late-night show appearances, and declining offers to publish his version of the events, because to him, it wasn't about a viral moment. It was about a larger truth about respect in the daily decisions we make to either extend or deny it. And though the media frenzy faded over time, the legacy of what happened didn't, because something changed that day. Not just on the plane or in the airport, but in the hearts of people watching. And I saw it firsthand weeks later at a local town hall where people of all backgrounds lined up not to ask about taxes or permits, but simply to say thank you to him, shake his hand, to tell him how proud they were that he had stood firm, not with fury, but with grace. And meanwhile, the court proceedings continued, public and transparent, with both Claire and Dunlap facing consequences not just in the legal sense, but socially and professionally. As their names became cautionary tales in corporate ethics, seminars and diversity training sessions across the country, and the airline, pressured by public outcry and government scrutiny, launched internal reviews, implemented new anti-bias training, and quietly removed Claire from duty. But none of that could undo what had already been done. And in classrooms across the South, teachers used the story as a modern-day parable, a real-life case study on judgment, humility, and the power of presence, while activists took to the streets with renewed energy, citing the incident as proof that representation and leadership matter, that people who look like Reeves should not only be seen, but respected and beyond the headlines. It was the subtle ripple effect that left the deepest mark: increased voter registration in Black communities, more support for local businesses, and a surge of young people applying for internships at City Hall, wanting to be part of something that felt real and rooted and just. And as for me, the quiet observer from Gate B12, I never forgot what I witnessed, not just the injustice, but the way it was answered. Not with rage, not with spectacle, but with unshakable integrity. And now whenever someone tells me that respect is something earned through loud titles or expensive suits, I tell them about the man in the leather jacket who sat in 3A, the man who said nothing for most of the flight, but taught everyone on board what leadership really looks like, and how sometimes the most powerful statement isn't shouted. It's simply standing your ground and refusing to move.